The rain had begun as a murmur, the kind that barely darkens stone, and by the time the carriage turned through the gates of Thornmere Hall, it had become something else entirely. It fell in sheets now, silver and relentless, drumming against the roof of the coach and pooling in the ruts of the gravel drive. Marin Ashby, who had been Marin Stowe until 11 days ago, sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap and watched the house reveal itself through the rain-streaked glass. It was enormous. Gray stone, darkened further by the weather, rising 3 stories above a wide sweep of steps. The windows were unlit. Not a single candle burned behind the glass, though it was barely past 4 o'clock, and the sky had turned the color of old pewter. Thornmere Hall looked precisely as it had been described to her, grand, cold, and entirely indifferent to whoever stood before it. The coachman brought the horses to a stop at the foot of the steps. The footman, a young man she did not yet know, opened the carriage door, and Marin stepped down into the rain. Her pelisse, dove-gray wool lined with silk, darkened instantly at the shoulders. Her bonnet caught the wind, and she pressed one hand to it, steadying herself on the wet gravel. Callum was already at the top of the steps. He had ridden ahead on horseback, had left the carriage at the last posting inn with a single instruction to his valet: "See that she arrives." He stood now beneath the stone portico, his riding coat still dry, his boots still clean. He looked down at her the way one looks at a trunk that has been delivered to the wrong address. "Mrs. Prent will show you the house," he said. His voice carried clearly despite the rain. "I have correspondence that will not wait." And then he turned, walked through the open door, disappeared into the darkness of the entrance hall without looking back, without offering his hand, without acknowledging that the woman standing at the foot of his steps, soaked to the skin, 12 days married to him, had just traveled 9 hours to reach a home she had never seen. The front door remained open, but no one came through it. Marin stood in the rain and waited. She understood what this was. She had understood it before she accepted his proposal, before the wedding breakfast that he left early, before the silent carriage ride from London, during which he had read correspondence, and she had watched the hedgerows blur past the window. Callum Ashby, Duke of Thornmere, had married her because his solicitor had advised it, and his steward had insisted upon it. The estate required an heir. His reputation required a wife. Marin Stowe, the second daughter of a country gentleman with modest means and an excellent name, had been the most convenient solution to both problems. She had known this. Her father had explained it plainly the evening the offer arrived. The Duke was not a man who loved, and he was not making an offer that included the pretense of it. What he offered was position, security, and the kind of life her family could not otherwise afford. What he expected in return was compliance, and eventually, a son. Marin had accepted because the alternative was a life of quiet dependency in her father's house, watching her elder sister's children grow while her own prospects diminished with each passing season. She had accepted because she was not a woman given to romantic illusions, and because she believed, with the particular certainty of someone who has watched people carefully all her life, that she could endure whatever coldness a man could produce if the endurance purchased something worth having. She had not, however, expected to be left standing in the rain. The minutes passed. 5. 10. The rain intensified, driving sideways now, soaking through the wool of her pelisse until it clung heavily to her arms and shoulders. Her bonnet, cream silk, trimmed with ribbon she had chosen herself for the journey, was ruined. Water ran from its brim in a thin, steady line down the front of her traveling dress. Her gloves, pale kid leather, had gone dark and shapeless. She did not move, not because she could not. The door was open. She could see the black and white tiles of the entrance hall, the foot of a staircase, the edge of a table bearing a candlestick that no one had lit. She could have walked up those steps and through that door, and no one would have stopped her. She was, after all, the Duchess of Thornmere. The house was, by law and by marriage, her home. But Marin understood something that most people did not. She understood that a door left open is not the same as an invitation. And she understood that the first act a woman performs in a new household defines every act that follows. If she walked through that door uninvited, she would be a guest, tolerated, peripheral, occupying space that had been grudgingly cleared. If she waited until she was received, she would be something else entirely. She would be the woman who stood in the rain with the composure of a duchess and the patience of stone. So she waited. Inside the house, Callum Ashby sat at his desk in the study and did not think about his wife. He thought about the letter from his solicitor regarding the drainage rights on the eastern tenancies. He thought about the sitting in the House of Lords he had missed the previous week, and the vote on the Poor Law Amendment that Viscount Hargrove had bungled in his absence. He thought about the accounts Aldgate had left on his desk, 3 months of expenditure that required his signature before the quarter closed. He did not think about Marin, because thinking about her would require acknowledging what he had done, and Callum was not yet prepared to do that. He had married her out of necessity. He had been civil during the ceremony, adequate during the breakfast, and silent during the journey north. He had done everything that was required. The fact that he had left her standing at the foot of his steps in the rain was not cruelty, he told himself. It was simply the natural order of a household asserting itself. She would come inside when she was ready. Mrs. Prent would see to her. What Callum did not tell himself, what he had not told anyone, not Aldgate, not his solicitor, not the portrait of his mother that hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room, was that the coldness was not natural to him. It was constructed, built deliberately, brick by careful brick, over the 8 years since his mother's death. She'd been the last person whose presence in this house he had not needed to justify to himself, and when she died, quietly, in the east bedchamber, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, while the garden below her window was still in bloom, something in Callum had sealed shut like a letter folded and pressed with wax. He had mourned her privately, briefly, and then he had set about the business of ensuring that no one would ever occupy enough space in his life to leave that kind of absence again. It had worked. For 8 years it had worked beautifully. The house ran, the estate prospered. He sat in the House of Lords and voted with sufficient competence. He was invited to dinners he did not attend, and balls he declined by post. He was, by every measure that society cared to apply, a man of consequence and good standing. He was also, by every measure that mattered, entirely alone. And now there was a woman standing in his reign. He opened the first letter, read 3 lines, set it down. He opened the second letter, read nothing. He stood and walked to the window. The study overlooked the front of the house, the portico, the steps, the curving gravel drive that swept toward the gate. The rain was heavier now, falling in curtains that blurred the tree line and turned the sky to gray wool. And there, at the foot of the steps, exactly where he had left her, stood his wife. She had not moved, not one step. She stood with her hands clasped before her, her ruined bonnet still on her head, her pelisse black with rain, and her face, even from this distance, even through the rain-smeared glass, utterly still. She was not looking at the house. She was not looking at the door. She was looking straight ahead, across the drive, at something he could not see, or perhaps at nothing at all, with an expression that held neither anger nor defeat, but something far worse. Patience. Callum felt something shift in his chest, a small, precise dislocation, like a drawer pulled open that had been locked for years. He stepped back from the window. Then he stepped forward again. She was still there. Of course she was still there. She was standing in the rain because he had put her there, and she had decided, with whatever unreadable calculation governed her, that she would not remove herself from the place where he had left her. He crossed the study in 4 strides, opened the door, walked down the corridor toward the entrance hall. His boots struck the stone floor with sharp, purposeful sounds that echoed in the unlit space. He passed Rook, the young footman, who stood at attention near the foot of the stairs with an expression that was carefully, painfully blank. "Your Grace," Rook said, and opened the front door wider. Callum walked through it and stopped at the edge of the portico. The rain roared around him. Below, perhaps 20 feet away, his wife stood in the full force of it. "Madam," he said. She turned her head, slowly, as though she had all the time in the world and he had interrupted something. The rain ran down her face. Her skin was very white against the dark, ruined fabric of her pelisse. Her eyes, gray, calm, steady, met his without flinching. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice did not waver. "You're standing in the rain." "I am. The door has been open for the better part of an hour." "It has." He waited for her to explain, to accuse, to weep or rage or say something that would allow him to dismiss her response as theatrical. She said nothing. She simply looked at him with those gray eyes and let the rain speak for her, every drop of it landing on her ruined clothes, her soaked gloves, her bonnet that would never recover, all of it a record of the hour he had left her there and the choice she had made to remain. "Come inside," he said. It was not a request. It, it was not gentle, but it was the first time since their wedding that he had spoken to her with something other than indifference, and they both knew it. "Is that an invitation, Your Grace?" The question was so quiet, he almost missed it beneath the rain, but he heard it, and he understood it. She was not asking whether she could enter the house. She was asking whether he was willing to acknowledge that she belonged in it. "It is," he said. She inclined her head, the slightest movement, barely visible through the rain, and walked up the steps. Her shoes left wet prints on the stone. Her pelisse dripped with every step. She passed him at the threshold and entered the hall, and the warmth of the house, such as it was, for Thornmere was not a warm house, closed around her like an afterthought. Mrs. Prent was waiting inside. She had been waiting, Marin suspected, since the carriage arrived. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and a face that revealed nothing, the kind of housekeeper who had served one family for 30 years and could read the weather of a household the way a farmer reads the sky. "Your Grace," Mrs. Prent said, addressing Marin directly, "I have had a fire lit in the east bedchamber and hot water drawn, if you will follow me." Marin followed her. She did not look back at Callum. She did not thank him for the invitation. She climbed the stairs in her ruined clothes, trailing water on every step, and disappeared around the turning of the staircase. Callum stood in the entrance hall and listened to the sound of her footsteps fading above him. Rook closed the front door. The rain continued outside, muffled now, distant. The house was silent. He went back to his study. He did not read his letters. The first week at Thornmere passed in silence, not the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other, but the heavy, watchful silence of two people who are taking measure. Callum kept to his study and his rides across the estate. Marin explored the house methodically, room by room, with Mrs. Prent as her guide and increasingly her ally. The house was magnificent and neglected in equal measure. The drawing room had not been used in years, the dust covers were gray with age, and the curtains smelled of damp. The morning room, which faced east and should have been the brightest room in the house, had its shutters half closed and its hearth unswept. The library held 3,000 volumes and no chairs comfortable enough to read in. Everywhere Marin looked, she saw a house that had been maintained to the minimum standard of respectability and not 1 degree beyond it. "The late Duchess passed 8 years ago," Mrs. Prent explained as they stood in the morning room. "His Grace has not seen the need for the rooms she favored." "I see," Marin said. She ran one gloved finger along the mantelpiece and examined the dust. "And the staff?" "Reduced. We are 14 where we were once 26. Aldgate manages the accounts. I manage the house. Between us, we manage His Grace." There was something in Mrs. Prent's voice, not disloyalty, never that, but a weariness that came from years of serving a man who did not notice the service. Marin heard it clearly. She heard everything clearly. It was, perhaps, her single greatest talent, the ability to listen not just to what people said, but to the architecture of silence around the words. "I should like to see the kitchen," Marin said. "The kitchen, Your Grace? If I am to oversee this household, I should know where the bread is baked." Mrs. Prent looked at her for a long moment. Then something changed in the housekeeper's face. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be named, but a settling, like a house adjusting to a new foundation. "This way, Your Grace." The kitchen at Thornmere was vast, stone-flagged, low-ceilinged, dominated by a hearth wide enough to stand inside. Copper pans hung from iron hooks along the far wall, though half of them had gone green with disuse. A scrubbed oak table ran the length of the room, scarred with decades of knife marks and flour dust. And at the far end, a woman of perhaps 50 stood rolling pastry with the methodical precision of someone who has done the same task 10,000 times and expects to do it 10,000 more. "Mrs. Hatch," Mrs. Prent said. "The Duchess." The cook looked up, wiped her hands on her apron, and curtsied, not deeply, not with any particular ceremony, but with the straightforward respect of a woman who judged people by what they did, not what they were called. "Your Grace, you will find the kitchen in order. I keep it so whether anyone looks or not." "I can see that," Marin said. She walked the length of the table, running her hand along its edge. The hearth was well tended, banked coals glowing beneath a pot of something that smelled of onion and thyme. The stone floor was swept clean. The bread, cooling on a rack near the window, was golden and even. Everything in the room spoke of competence maintained in the absence of recognition, and Marin understood that language intimately. "How many do you cook for, Mrs. Hatch?" 14 staff. His Grace when he remembers to eat, which is not daily. "It will be daily now," Marin said, "and it will be for 15 staff by the end of the month. I intend to recall Mary and Agnes if they are willing." Mrs. Hatch and Mrs. Prent exchanged a glance, brief, loaded, communicating something that had been hoped for and not expected. Mrs. Hatch returned to her pastry. "They will be willing, Your Grace. They have been waiting to be asked." Within a fortnight, the morning room shutters were open. Within 3 weeks, the drawing room dust covers were removed and the curtains replaced. Marin did not do this work herself. She was not a servant, and she understood the boundaries of her position with the same precision she understood everything else. But she directed it. Through Mrs. Prent, she reorganized the cleaning rotations, recalled 2 maids who had been let go the previous year, and commissioned new hearthrugs for the rooms that had gone cold. Callum noticed none of it. Or rather, he noticed all of it, and said nothing. He came down to breakfast each morning and found the dining room warmer than he remembered. He walked through the entrance hall and found fresh candles in the sconces. He passed the morning room and saw sunlight streaming through windows that had been shuttered for years. He said nothing, because to say something would be to acknowledge that his wife had in the space of 3 weeks done more for Thornmere than he had done in 8 years. Aldgate noticed. The steward was a careful man, lean, precise, uncomfortable with anything that could not be accounted for in a ledger. He had served the late Duke, and now served Callum with the same methodical loyalty, and he had watched the new Duchess's quiet renovation of the household with the particular attention of a man whose territory was being encroached upon. "Her Grace has requested the household accounts for the last quarter," Aldgate informed the Duke during their Tuesday meeting. His tone was neutral. His meaning was not. "Has she?" "She has asked Mrs. Prent to compile them." Callum looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. "And Mrs. Prent complied?" "Mrs. Prent appears to have aligned herself with the Duchess's program, Your Grace." Callum set down his pen. He thought of his wife standing in the rain. He thought of the morning room shutters, open for the first time in years. He thought of the fresh candles and the hearth rugs and the 2 recalled maids whose wages he had not yet been asked to approve. "Let her see them," he said. Aldgate opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once, and withdrew. The accounts, when Marin reviewed them, told a story that the house itself had already whispered to her. Thornmere was wealthy, enormously so. The estate produced an income that could have sustained a household of 60 and a social calendar to rival any in the county. But the money had been managed with the rigid austerity of a man who spent nothing because spending required decisions, and decisions required engagement, and engagement required caring about something beyond the walls of his study. She did not confront Callum with this. She did not need to. She simply began, through Mrs. Prent and with Aldgate's reluctant cooperation, to spend the money as it should have been spent. Repairs to the tenant cottages that had been delayed for 2 seasons, new linen for the bedchambers, firewood deliveries to the 3 poorest families on the estate who had been supplementing their hearths with hedge cutting since the previous winter. It was the firewood that brought the first tenant to the kitchen door, a man called Jessup, weathered, broad-shouldered, hat in his hands, who asked to speak to the Duchess. Mrs. Prent brought him through to the morning room, where Marin was reviewing the household linen inventory. He stood on the threshold and would not sit, though she offered twice. "Your Grace, the wood arrived this morning. I came to say, my wife asked me to say, we are grateful. There's no need for gratitude, Mr. Jessup. The estate has an obligation to its tenants. The obligation was overdue." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something he had believed to be fixed. "The late Duchess used to walk the cottages at Michaelmas, brought preserves and linen. It has been some years since anyone came." "Then it has been some years too long," Marin said. "I shall walk them next week. Mrs. Prent will arrange it." Jessup nodded. He turned his hat in his hands twice more, then bowed and withdrew. By the end of the month, 3 more tenants had come to the kitchen door, not with complaints, not with demands, but with the tentative, watchful approach of people who had been forgotten and were not yet certain they had been remembered. Marin remembered them. She walked the cottages with Mrs. Prent and noted every cracked lintel, every damp wall, every roof that wanted rethatching. She compiled the list in her own hand and presented it to Aldgate without comment. Aldgate reviewed it, calculated the costs, and presented it to the Duke. "Her Grace's assessment of the cottages," he said, placing the document on Callum's desk. Callum read it, every item, every line. He recognized the handwriting, precise, slanted slightly to the right, written with an economy that wasted neither ink nor space. He signed the authorization without a word. A pianoforte for the drawing room came next, because Maren played, and because music was the first thing she had sacrificed when she married a man who valued silence. The pianoforte arrived on a Tuesday. Callum heard it before he saw it, the sound of something being uncrated in the entrance hall, the scrape of wood against tile, Mrs. Prent's voice directing the footman. He came out of his study and found the instrument standing in the hall, enormous and gleaming, while three men debated how to navigate the doorway of the drawing room. Maren was not there. She was upstairs in the east bedchamber, reading a letter from her sister. She had ordered the pianoforte and then removed herself from its arrival with the instinct of a woman who understood that a man like Callum would resent being confronted with evidence of her influence. He would see it. He would know she had ordered it, and he would have the privacy to decide how he felt about it before he had to face her. He said nothing about the pianoforte at dinner, but that evening, as Maren sat in the drawing room playing a piece she had learned as a girl, something by Clementi, delicate and precise, she heard the study door open down the corridor. She heard footsteps. She heard them stop. He stood in the corridor and listened. She knew he was there. He knew she knew. Neither of them acknowledged it. She played to the end of the piece, closed the lid, and went upstairs. When she passed the corridor, it was empty. It was 6 weeks before Callum Ashby spoke more than 10 words to his wife in a single conversation. The occasion was unremarkable, a matter of household business that required his signature. Maren brought the document to his study herself because Aldgate was visiting the tenants and Mrs. Prent was occupied with the linen inventory. She knocked. He said, "Enter." She placed the paper on his desk, explained what it authorized, the repair of the east wing roof, which had been leaking into the servants' quarters, and waited for his signature. He signed it. And then, for reasons he could not afterward explain, he said, "You have changed the house." It was not a question. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact delivered in the same tone he used to note the weather or the price of grain. But Maren heard what lived beneath it, the bewilderment of a man who had lived in a mausoleum for 8 years and woken one morning to find himself in a home. "I have not changed it," she said. "I have maintained it. There is a difference." He looked at her. She stood on the other side of his desk in a morning dress of pale blue muslin, her dark hair pinned simply, her hands folded. She looked exactly as she had looked on the day she arrived, composed, patient, entirely herself, except that she was dry now and warm and standing in a room that she had filled with new candles because the old ones had been burning unevenly. "You stood in the rain for an hour," he said. The words came out before he could stop them. They had been sitting in his chest for 6 weeks, pressing against the inside of his ribs like something swallowed wrong. "I did," she said. "Why?" She considered the question, not quickly, not with the practiced ease of someone who has prepared an answer, but with the genuine thoughtfulness of someone who wishes to tell the truth. "Because you left me there," she said, "and I wanted you to see what that looked like." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Callum had ever heard. It filled the study, it pressed against the windows, it sat in the chair opposite his desk and refused to leave. "I see," he said. "I do not think you do," she said. "Not yet. But I am patient." She collected the signed document and left. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. Callum sat at his desk and stared at the space where she had stood and felt for the first time in years the unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation of being seen. The months that followed were not a transformation. Callum Ashby did not become a tender husband overnight, and Maren did not expect him to. What happened was slower and less dramatic, a gradual erosion of the walls he had built, worn away not by force but by the persistent, quiet presence of a woman who asked nothing of him except that he witnessed the life she was building in his house. She appeared at breakfast every morning. She managed the household with increasing confidence, conferring with Mrs. Prent each morning and meeting with Aldgate each Wednesday to review the accounts. She played the pianoforte in the evenings. She wrote letters to her sister and received them in return. She walked the grounds when the weather was fine and read in the library when it was not, sitting in the new chair she had ordered, the one positioned near the window where the light was best. Callum began, without deciding to adjust his own habits around hers. He took breakfast at the same hour. He left his study door open in the evenings when she played. He found himself walking through rooms he had not entered in years, simply because she had made them worth entering. One evening in late autumn, 3 months after her arrival, he sat down in the drawing room while she played. He did not announce himself. He simply walked in, sat in the chair nearest the hearth, and listened. She glanced at him once, a look so brief it barely registered, and continued playing. The fire cracked and settled in the grate. Outside, the wind moved through the trees along the south lawn, and somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. Mrs. Prent making her evening rounds, checking the candles, turning down the beds, performing the invisible rituals that held a household together. The music filled the room the way light fills a window, not aggressively, not demanding attention, but simply present, changing the quality of everything it touched. Callum watched her hands on the keys. She played with the same precision she brought to everything. No wasted movement, no theatrical flourishes, just the clean articulation of each note in its proper place. Her back was straight, her head was slightly inclined. In the candlelight, her profile had the quality of something carved, not cold, not remote, but finished, complete in a way that made ornamentation unnecessary. He realized, sitting there, that he had not heard music in this house since his mother died. Not because there had been no instrument, the old pianoforte still stood in the music room upstairs, covered and silent, but because music required someone willing to break the silence, and for 8 years no one in this house had been willing to do that. No one, it seemed, until Morin. When the piece ended, she said, without turning, "You are welcome to stay." "I know," he said. She began another piece. He stayed. He stayed until the candles burned low and the fire needed tending, and when he finally rose to leave, he paused at the doorway and said, quietly, almost to himself, "That was Clementi." "Yes," she said, and smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It was not a large smile, not a bright one. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for something small and specific and had, at last, received it. He went to his study. He did not close the door. By winter, they ate dinner together every evening. The conversation was spare at first. The estate, the tenants, a letter from Callum's solicitor, a question about the Christmas accounts. But gradually, imperceptibly, the silences between the words began to change. They were no longer the silences of two strangers occupying the same room. They were the silences of two people who were learning, with great care and considerable awkwardness, to share the same life. It was Mrs. Prent who observed it first. She said nothing, of course. Mrs. Prent never said anything that was not strictly necessary, but she began setting the dining table differently. The candelabra moved to the center. The flowers appeared. The good china came out of the cupboard where it had sat unused since the late Duchess's death. It was Callum who said, one evening over a dinner of roast pheasant and winter vegetables, with the candelabra casting warm pools of light across the white cloth and the hearth burning steadily behind them, "I owe you an apology." Marin set down her fork. She did not prompt him. She waited. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. A log shifted in the grate, sending a brief constellation of sparks up the chimney. "For the day you arrived, for leaving you in the rain, it was—" He paused. The word he wanted, cruel, unforgivable, monstrous, stuck in his throat like a bone. He looked down at his plate, then back at her. His jaw was set in the way it always was when he forced himself to do something that his pride fought against. "It was beneath me." "Yes," she said simply. "It was. I have spent 8 years conducting myself as though this house required nothing beyond maintenance, as though it were a machine that needed only winding. You have shown me, without once saying it directly, which I suspect was deliberate, that I was wrong." "It was deliberate," she said. There was no apology in her voice. There was no triumph either. It was a statement of method, delivered with the same calm she brought to every interaction, the acknowledgement that she had known exactly what she was doing from the moment she stepped out of that carriage. "I am not a man who apologizes easily. I am aware. But I'm apologizing now." She looked at him across the candlelight, this tall, difficult, proud man who had spent 8 years turning his house into a tomb and was now sitting across from her, admitting that he had been wrong. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes, something deep and quiet and very old, softened. "I know," she said. "That is why it matters." They finished dinner in silence. It was the best silence Thornmere had ever known. 3 years passed. Thornmere Hall was unrecognizable, not in its architecture, which remained the same gray stone it had always been, but in its temperament. The rooms were warm, the gardens were tended, the tenants came to the house at Christmastide and were received in the great hall with cider and music. Maren had borne 2 children, a son in the first year and a daughter in the second, and the nursery, which had been closed and shuttered since Callum's own childhood, rang with sounds that the house had forgotten it could hold. Callum sat in the House of Lords when Parliament required it, but he returned to Thornmere as quickly as the roads allowed. He had become, without quite intending it, a man who wished to be home. The study door stood permanently open now. The pianoforte was joined by a second, smaller instrument that Maren was teaching their son to play, though the boy was only 3 and more interested in the pedals than the keys. On a Tuesday in late October, the rain returned to Thornmere. Not a drizzle, but a genuine storm, the kind that turned the gravel drive to mud and bent the trees along the approach. Maren stood at the window of the morning room and watched it fall. "Mama," her daughter said from the rug near the hearth, where she was arranging wooden animals in a line. "Why is Papa standing outside?" Maren looked. Callum was at the foot of the front steps, the exact spot where she had stood 3 years ago. He was coatless, hatless, standing in the rain with his arms at his sides and his face turned up toward the window where she stood. She went downstairs. She opened the front door. Rook, who was no longer a boy but a young man now, stepped aside without being asked. Maren walked to the edge of the portico and looked down at her husband. "You're standing in the rain," she said. "I am. You will ruin your coat. You are not wearing a coat." "No. How long have you been out here?" "Long enough." She descended the steps. The rain hit her immediately. Cold, clean, relentless. She walked across the gravel until she stood before him, close enough to see the rain running down his face, close enough to see that his eyes, dark, serious, utterly fixed on her, held nothing she had ever seen there before. "I wanted to know what it felt like," he said. She looked at him. The rain soaked through her dress. It ran down her neck and into her collar. She did not move. "And?" "It felt," he said carefully, "like the most important hour of my life was the one I wasted." She reached up and touched his face, her bare hand against his wet cheek, warm despite the rain. He closed his eyes. "It was not wasted," she said. "I was exactly where I needed to be." He took her hand. They walked up the steps together. Rook held the door. Mrs. Prent stood in the entrance hall with 2 lengths of linen and an expression that, for the first time in 30 years of service, might have been a smile. The fire in the drawing room was already lit. The children's laughter echoed from the nursery above. The rain continued outside, steady, unhurried, falling against the old stone of Thornmere Hall with the patience of something that understands that even the hardest surfaces, given enough time, grow warm. They arrive here, like rain against stone, persistent, unhurried, certain that in time even the hardest surface yields. They arrive whenever they are ready,